To be able to have this conversation tonight. I think we started talking about our work really together at graduate school at Columbia. I'm about to graduate. Matthew graduated last year from the MFA program, which like many of you are enrolled in. We started talking about our work really just through being peers, and then we had this experience of working in this great blog called The New Nothing, which everyone should check out, and several other artists who participated in it are also here. But it's a photographic conversation, basically, and there's many different conversations that you can check in on.
It's organized by Ben Alper and Nat Ward, two great photographers. Basically, they pair photographers with each other, and the photographers go back and forth, posting photographs. So the first is Rachel's photograph, and then mine, and then Rachel.
Except for it goes in the other order, because they build off each other.
What are the?
It started here.
Oops. Oh, did it?
Yeah.
So yeah, we started here.
So it's like a call and response, basically, and you can follow different. We follow different sort of threads.
And we're both people who work a lot with our own archives. So a lot of the work is, some of it's new, some of it's old. So there's been a lot of commonalities about our work that run through our work that have sort of existed for a long time that we kind of never knew about, which is why it's exciting for us to be here together to speak to you. Because now, we're looking specifically at each other's work, but it's really interesting to look back through our archives and actually find that there are a lot of really serious commonalities.
So I think
which express themselves in this piece, this little conversation we're having.
And you'll see as we get into it, but a photograph like this, which is mine and doesn't really look anything like my work, is something that I don't really get to think about until I'm looking at a photograph of Matthew's that looks like this.
Right, and this is just some weird outtake from something I did for fun. So it's also nice to be able to have the freedom to just enjoy ourselves.
So I think what we'll do tonight is we prefer if it was more casual. So I think that we'll kind of introduce ourselves and then we'll have a conversation. But we encourage you guys to be part of it. And
in typical Matthew Rachel fashion, who's ever speaking the loudest is the one who has control of the room.
It's called a terrible compromise.
Yeah, that's our talk.
That's what we call it when we hang out, so that's what it's going to be. And we'll come back to A New Nothing, but I do really encourage you guys to check it out because, as you can see, there are many conversations. These are just the ongoing ones, and there are archived ones, and it's exciting. It's like an exciting kind of visual logic. Okay, I'm going to show you guys a lot of pictures. I'm going to take off my glasses so I don't have to see them.
Could we ask questions?
Yeah, please.
Did you know each other before you were paired?
So
I knew nothing, or?
Yeah, so Matthew and I went to school together, and who asked the question? Just so I know where to point my face. Okay, Matthew and I went to graduate school together, and actually, you're not paired by the curators. An artist gets invited, and then they choose the person they want to be in conversation with. So I was asked to participate, and Matthew and I have already been in a very serious and ongoing conversation with at least weekly sort of two-person maybe shouting matches, and it just made sense. The conversation was already underway, so it just made sense. But yes, we already knew each other and our work very well. And I think that the artists who participate in general, I mean, Matt, you invited, or were invited, and you already knew the person you were talking to. So I think that it's what's exciting about it is that the conversations are sort of naturally existing, and then they get displaced. And some of them are weird, I forget who, but one person's in conversation with the New York Times, and they reply to
Tristan Zara.
Yeah, so I think it's, all kind of photo conversation or art conversation things, it's just a different format. Okay, so I started working in the studio in 2011. Before that I had been making photographs out in the world. And it was a really important shift for me, mostly because I knew what many of these photographs looked like before I began thinking about making them, and it was a really strange and exciting experience for me as a photographer who had really been raised on, we'll use the term street photography, both in terms of my education and my practice, to feel this different sense of control. And originally my whole relationship with working in the studio was what I would call at the time, and still sometimes use, this idea between like the real and fake. So this is from a series of still lifes I did that were all called Real and Fake whatever. This one is called Still Life with Real and Fake Flowers. And I was interested in sort of like what I was able to do within the framework of a photograph that could talk about the feeling that I was having and the tension between having left the world for the studio, whatever that meant. So like, what was the real thing and what was the fake thing? And through that relationship, originally starting with still life, I became very involved in drag communities. Again, thinking about this body as something that is both real and fake at the same time. And by that I mean, this is a portrait of actually 3 people. This is a portrait of my friend Josh, my friend Ari, and of an odalisque, right? So I was interested in how those things could happen at the same time, and how that happened in concert with the objects and the sort of art historical references that I had been dealing with. Still Life with Real and Fake Lemons. And also interested in like this idea of sort of accessible opulence. So I was interested in the idea that these were things that like were designed to be sold in suburbia, that were mass produced, but that referenced very like acute history of decorative arts kind of moments. So here we're looking at something that I bought at a Salvation Army, but is clearly in reference to Rococo porcelain table decoration. And I think through the experience of thinking about this like tension between real and fake, I became interested in a history of kitsch, which was a word that I was allergic to for a really long time. This is called anal as sorceress. And I think that like I initially resisted kitsch as sort of a classist response to my work. I understood it as somebody saying that it was cheap rather than the real like complexity and history of that term. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about real and fake through that history, which I pinpoint as really starting sort of like with the Crystal Palace and like Rococo. I don't want to be too like art history nerdy specific, but in short, if we think about the production, the mass production of sheets of glass, which is mirrors, windows, terrariums, aquariums, we start to also use that technology as a way to define space as interior and exterior, to be able to have things that are quantified like souvenirs, snow globes, fish tanks. And that leads to a culture of nostalgia and like a souvenir kind of vibe, which has a lot to do with the history of photography, right? So there's sort of like this moment that's very technology based where we become very concerned with keeping versions of things that aren't necessarily the real thing. I'm gonna pause in my kitsch rant to just explain this picture really quickly because I don't get to explain it really often, and it's one of my few photographs that could use an explanation. Thinking about kitsch and also like the political and social issues surrounding decorative arts and the way that we adorn things. This is a photograph called Still Life with Bones from Heart Mountain, which is a Japanese internment camp in Wyoming that has been left to basically rot. There's no financial support or like memorial there. And at the bottom are some bleached animal bones that I collected there. And then there's mass-produced fake porcelain and chinois fabric, really a, I don't know how to say it in French, but the Japanese version of chinois fabric that was bought at Joanne Fabric. So thinking about like what products are provided to us to talk about our history as like a place and how they end up like falling into our lives. So I think that I probably bought this same fabric as a kid and like did a sewing project with my grandma because I thought it was beautiful and didn't really think about all of those complexities. And it's something that you see in the mass-produced objects that I'm able to use a lot. Sorry, I think I should go back to a different still life. Well, I'll point them out as they come up. But I made these pictures for a long time, and I'm going to click through them quickly to get to the next section. Okay, so real and fake, right? So then I began to think through that, not only about the history of the objects, but about more specifically the history of the images and what I was raised in art school to call visual literacy, which basically means thinking about like how a single image can be repeated throughout different types of images and still be read and understood in the same way. So I developed fascinations with characters, like this is a portrait of Salome, as sort of understood through the painter Gustave Moreau, and thinking about how we identify Salome as Salome when we see her in Tudor sleeves versus an Oriental gown versus you know, in the nude or something like that, and that there are these symbols like the veils that have come off, or you see often a severed head on a platter, which is another photograph that goes with this one that I don't have here. And from that, this is not my photograph. From that I got really into op art. From that sort of began to think about, in the same way I've been thinking about objects as holding power, like the mass-produced fake porcelain candlesticks, how different types of subjects hold power in images. So I really started thinking specifically about how I'd been photographing drag queens, my relationship as a woman photographing men in a beautified state, and the relationship of a reader understanding it primarily as a portrait of femininity versus masculinity. So I started making a series of pictures of men, and I was thinking about it less in terms of a specific presentation of masculinity and more in terms of the men that I knew, and that was really the only criteria. I was also working off of a book called The Manual for Male Photography, which is a technical guide that teaches you how to photograph men. And it's really a thinly veiled collection of homoerotic images. But it has great tips, like it says things like, red is a great accent color. You can't tell in the projection, but that's really red. Or it says things like, try wetting their shorts. But again, still, like with the older work, I was thinking about still these tensions of real and fake, what we're willing to believe, and then of course, like how that all changes within the frame of the photograph, where everything is as real or as fake as we're willing to commit ourselves to understanding it. So this is fake red coral, which in the history of decorative arts, like both red coral and fake red coral have really important lineages and mean sort of different things. And you can find scientific guides from like the 1500s talking about how coral is the bridge between land and earth, because if you snap coral in half, you'll find the actual branch of a tree, which means that a scientist was given fake red coral and recorded it as this other thing, as the real thing. And so you have this sort of conflation even in like collections, natural history collections, about like what is fake and what is real and where the value is in that. Somebody asked if there was going to be nudity before the lecture started. So, Manual for Male Photography. After thinking about men, I decided to think about women, and I started making a series of images that dealt with sort of like a glamorized sense of violence against women. Oh, I had my slides in the wrong order. I'm not talking about women yet. I was thinking about allegory too. So I made a series of photographs that are just sort of like distilled allegory, and I think that that's something when Matthew and I find common ground in our work, a lot of it has to do with like a sort of distilled sense of indicator rather than referent. And so these are pictures that I made, which are like allegory without context was the idea. So power or law, nature or mortality, wealth or power, power or power, indulgence, titillation, sensuality, time or death, death or death, or life. and now I can talk about women. So thinking about those symbols and all of these other things that have been the sort of foundation of my work, what I've been working on most recently is basically still life self-portraiture and installation, including video, that is dealing with women and sort of glamour and violence. So this is a picture referencing back to Salome. It's called Salome's Skin, which comes from Oscar Wilde's version of the play, where he says her skin is like a white rose reflected in a silver mirror. So inherent in all of these things are both like beauty, sexual violence, racial violence, celebration. Like, I'm interested in sort of like how these things can be successful and oppressive at the same time. This is the severed breast of the Princess of Lamballe and the severed head of the Princess of Lamballe, who was Marie Antoinette's best friend. And this is how she was executed. This is the view from Marie Antoinette's jail cell. This is Medea. I don't know if it's before or after she's murdered her children, but it's definitely after she murdered her brother. This is an odalisque with someone else's face, or a drag queen drew her face on my face. This is Lady Macbeth. And then this is what I've been doing most recently, which is thinking about sort of creating temples that summarize all of these things. And for me, religious spaces are movie theaters, so I've been making movie theaters. And this one is called Is That All There Is? I attempt to effectively lip sync Peggy Lee's version of the song Is That All There Is, with allegory surrounding me. I made a billboard, I'm not going to talk about that. And then I did, for most recently, my thesis project, which is up at the Fisher Landau Center in Queens right now, Adam and Eve as children, flowers for Dessasant and flowers for Mrs. Dalloway, and Zeus approaching Leda, which all came together to create the facade of a photographic movie curtain that I made just around this projection of a film about Pygmalion studio love. So all of that was sort of like, I guess, a long-winded run-through of everything I've ever done. But I think I just want to kind of like set the tone so that Matthew and I can get into it more specifically.
Yeah.
So that's
again, in typical Matthew Rachel fashion, it's just a barrage of a lot of images.
A barrage of a lot of images. But I think that a point of commonality is that we both need a lot of images to make it happen.
Yes. I agree. How do I do this? Okay, so when I first started taking pictures, it was probably, I don't know, it was a few years ago. It was mostly a psychological enterprise, not really a photographic or artistic enterprise. And so what I was doing, I was reading a lot of Freud at the time, and I was thinking, basically what he posits with the Oedipus complex is that all of human pathology is based on this suppression of desire for a parent. And I wanted to really test that, to really figure out what that meant. Because, a really important factor of being a homosexual is that you're suppressing your desire for a long time in order to kind of fit in. And so like what that meant in terms of like a larger sensibility of like sexual suppression, and how Freud kind of posited that in the 19th century, especially being a photographer who really prized aesthetics from the 19th century. Looking at all of those things, both the aesthetics from the 19th century and the psychology from the 19th century, and like this suppression of desire, it kind of came together to begin to make this work. So, I started to meet men online and in other places, older men, putting myself in these situations with them, salacious and otherwise. Making a reference to, what is the Eggleston portrait of the radio flyer? It's Eggleston, right? He had a radio flyer. I sat on it. This little reference to Andy Warhol. Okay. That's not real. So, I started to look at, I mean, he photographed me, I photographed him. The project kind of expanded into this photographic enterprise to see kind of how cameras work. What does it mean to be photographed? What does it mean to photograph someone? And I jumped back and forth over the course of time. This was made like 2 years ago. This stuff was made 3 or 4 years ago. This is one of the first pictures. Bodies in space. This is, an odalisque. That's a theme that we sort of comes up a lot in both
People
of our
look
work.
great lying down.
They do. I think I just wanted to be held or something. I got held a lot. I spent some time alone. That was cool. A lot of it kind of was like, it was a really weird, interesting experience to go through, to like meet all these older men who had been living in New York for a while. Some of them had kids, some of them had AIDS, some of them came out 5 years ago, some of them came out 30 years ago. It was just a really long, intense, personal experience of meeting all these people and having these like very seriously intimate moments with them. And so in terms of this like Freudian enterprise, I think like the whole thing, I sort of like realized at a certain point that the whole thing was complete shit. And I like just like, it's just ridiculous, like the idea that, there's any one kind of idea that could, summarize human pathology is just like crazy. So I just kind of let that go and started kind of just making pictures in a lot of ways. So these are all of the previous pictures were made in New York. And if you saw, like, there are references to stuff like the Village People and, other stuff. So I started making pictures in Berlin in 2013-ish. And I started using this like mirror thing that comes up, I think, in my work a lot and Rachel's work a lot. Sort of as this way to talk about, I guess in a way to talk about photography. Because mirrors are invented in the same time that photography is invented. Well, they're not invented, but the way that we have mirrors now, this quicksilver mirror that's very easily reproducible, they're invented around the same time in the 19th century, in like I think mirrors are like 1830, and the camera is like 1827. So there's this really important need for this kind of self-referential or like, experience to fix something, to see yourself. And, how I think there was that sensibility that I wanted to talk about in the work, and I also wanted to talk about, how do we break up visual space? In painting, it's kind of, there's this figure-ground relationship, there's this whole history of how like space is broken up. And in photography, to me, it was always sort of complicated of how that works and how do I work through that and sort of think about the history of the medium in relationship to that. So mirrors were a way for me to like break up visual space in a new and exciting way. So like this image, it's obviously, about desire, and I'm this figure here, but it was just also kind of where am I placing the viewer in terms of how they're understanding the image. So like the viewer is obviously you're here, but I'm behind them. And so it's like that reference to that Velázquez portrait, the Las Meninas, where the viewer is in the front, the Velázquez is, you can see him behind painting, and then what you see reflected in the mirror at the end is the parents. So looking at the child in the front. So it's like this sensibility of being not just a viewer, but the parent of the child that is supposed to be the center of the portrait. So I think in a lot of ways it was just kind of messing with that relationship of who the viewer was and where they were placed in terms of both their empathy for the figure or their relationship to the figure. Some of them are like self-portraits. And there's mirror thing again. Lots of like Lucian Freud. Well, Lucian Freud, I mean, grandson of regular Freud. So again, this.
Regular Freud?
Daddy Freud. Well, granddaddy, I guess. More odalisques. One of the things that I think is really interesting, one of the interesting commonalities in our work was also what Rachel was talking about, this relationship between what's real and what's fake. This is a good place to talk about that. I think Rachel kind of does it a lot with objects, of like what you're looking at, is it real or is it fake? And I kind of do a similar thing with emotions, I think, of just like what is actually happening in this image. Like who, I mean, this is sort of different. But who's desiring who, what is the desire for, and how does that work? And I think this was, I don't want to talk. So like something like this, just like an Adam and Eve kind of thing. My relationship with this guy was really interesting. He was really he's like a model in Berlin. And he's from the East, or he grew up in East Germany, and so his English wasn't super great. But there's this really interesting thing that happened, of course, when we're in East Berlin. Was he in East Berlin? Anyway, where when the wall came up, well, I don't really have time. Well, when the wall came up, so there's this like they're building this socialist republic, right? And so everybody's like German and they're buying all the same things and doing all the same things. And when the wall comes up, it's supposed to be this really great thing that happens to everybody. They're like, subject to capitalism and they can get whatever they want, and it's like consumer culture and we can listen to music and dance, yay! But that's not actually really how it happened. You can't just really lift a wall and change a complete group of people into understanding a whole culture. So there's this sense in which all of this time that they spent becoming a certain kind of person that grew up in East Germany changes and shifts. And all of these people have to spend the rest of their lives adjusting to that. And I felt like he really was craving that. He was really craving meeting me and being photographed by me and spending time just like being a person and enjoying his life and learning English and learning French. And that was really, and it was like, all of those things were really hard for him. And so the time that I spent with him was really this interesting struggle for us both to understand each other in terms of language, but also culturally. And that's part of what I was interested in photographing when I was making this picture, and also when I was photographing in Germany, is just like understanding the culture of Germany. Both in terms of its liberalism, because you go to Berlin, if anybody is like gay now and you go to Berlin, or it's like, it's like you come home, like in a sense, because it's like there's this interesting liberalism that has occurred as a result of all of these problems that have happened there. And it's also interesting, when the wall was down, there was this also false liberalism that in the East they tried to perpetuate. So like nudity in public was like allowed, which is why if you've ever gone to the lake, like public nudity is like really encouraged. And that was also really strange, because it was like this kind of false sensibility of liberalism that was like really a problem, I guess. This is all new stuff. Mirrors, identity, what's real, what's fake, through the looking glass, all of that stuff, I suppose, is there. I don't have a lot to say about this stuff yet.
I think one of the things we were talking about on the way over here that was really exciting to me was what you brought up about the idea of like pre-modern aesthetics and how that relates to, like for example, this man's experience between these two places and two times.
Mm.
So I guess what we've been thinking about was this idea that like,
This is New Orleans. From here, this is New Orleans. These 5 pictures. Yeah.
I guess I'm just interested, I think like what you were saying before about this idea about like what specifically about a pre-modern aesthetic is able to talk about, to use the word like allegory in a way that is like outside of the political or the specifically referent.
Yeah.
And thinking about like who these men are that you're photographing and like, are they representing themselves or are they representing an older man or a gay man or...
Right, so what we were talking about in the ride over here is this, there's a, T.J. Clark is our art historian, he talks about the death of Morrocco. Maybe we can pull it up actually. Because I think it's really important in terms of both of our work. T.J. Clark talks about the death of Marat as the first modernist painting. What he means by that is basically what he says is that it takes the stuff of politics and doesn't transmute it. So he takes David. Well, David is a revolutionary, and he's I think the painting was 1758. I'm sorry, 1798. So this is. Was it Jean Paul Marat?
I don't know his first name, I just know Marat.
Anyway, this is Marat. He's a revolutionary, he's a Jacobin, he's like kind of a contentious figure, but when he's murdered by Charlotte Corday, whose husband was killed during one of the battles in the French Revolution, and she blames Marat and kills him. And so what happens is David takes this moment, because David is a super famous portrait artist at the time, sort of like the Annie Leibovitz of, late 18th century France, and he's great at marketing. And so what he does is he really quickly is like, come on, Robespierre et al. We're gonna like paint. I'm gonna paint this portrait. You're gonna put it up in the front of the Louvre, and then we're gonna copy it and parade it through the streets, and the revolution is gonna happen. And in a sense, it's sort of this beginning of media, where this portrait is perpetuated through the streets to rally revolutionaries, to get people kind of excited about the revolution. And it's really, at least in the way that T.J. Clark talks about it, it's the first time that art becomes political or topical, as Rachel pointed out earlier. Because before, it's all allegorical. He's painting portraits of the rape of the intervention of the Sabine women. It's like neoclassical. It's sort of like you take the aesthetics of and
even in painting
Roman
that is
culture.
Intended as document, there's a fair amount of poetic representation.
Right, and I think in your work a lot, you're using this like poetic representation of these allegorical sensibilities, where you have these landscapes in the background, and like there's this something kind of going on, or sort of referencing something that happened a long time ago, in order to talk about something that is happening now. Whereas this is, it's the first moment, at least in the way T.J. Clark says, where that's not present. It's just what's happening now. And I think that that's something that photography changed or facilitated, or this sort of happened before photography is invented. This moment in which painting sort of transitions from being this allegorical sensibility to being this really political sensibility. And if anybody's seen do you want to pull up The Death of Bara? The unfinished show at the Met Breuer. There's a painting by David, which I think was painted a few years right after, 2 or 3 years right after the death of Marat, and it's called The Death of Bara. And that one. And it's obviously it's in the unfinished show, so it's unfinished. So painting doesn't really have this ability to really like be as quick in terms of its, as photography is. This is Joseph Bara. He's a drummer boy who's killed during a battle in the French Revolution. So what happens, David paints the portrait, and again, it's a similar thing of the death of Marat, where it's used to rally revolutionaries and get people excited. It's sort of used for political ends. And
so I think like what we're thinking about is pinpointing this as a moment wherein classical aesthetics, the portrait, all of these things that are like art historically
photography
familiar.
and media.
Well, pitting it against that. So like
Right.
thinking about how this is a place where sort of painting and photography make an exchange, and what we're kind of thinking about is like where the value is in locating that historical moment and saying like essentially this is a place where painting attempts to do what photography now in its most general function does.
Right, because
Image something and disseminate that information, and at the same time photography then comes quickly on the heels of that and is able to like fill that void. So what then is the value as artists in picking up from that historical moment and moving forward really in the track of pre-modern painting or like pre this moment in painting, but through the creation of photographs. And yeah, that was a horrifying and poignant comparison.
like I mean the point in saying all of this is that I think in both of us in terms of the way that we relate to aesthetics is that what we are trying to say with our work is that right now photography is in its most important time. Is that, you know, if that really important aesthetic shift in painting was happening at the turn of the 18th century, and David paints something like this to kind of be to have a political end, and in the 21st century we're getting something like this that kind of changed the Syrian refugee crisis in a lot of ways, sort of got people excited about, changed a lot of opinions. You know, German austerity kind of shifts after this photograph is made. And so, in my opinion, I think in both of our opinion, you know, the aesthetics of photography are in terms of the way that they relate to politics and the way that they relate to the history of aesthetics. It's right now is the moment when that's the most important thing that's happened. And so at least that's my spiel about why photography is the most important art form.
But I don't get the right now part of it, because, you know, photography's function in that sense has been happening in media for a long time.
Yeah.
So what do you mean about right now?
Well, I think it has been happening for a long time, but the way that painting, this photograph has been shared and appropriated and used is different than it was before. So if we have like a painting, a photograph of like the Dorothy Lang's photograph of the migrant mother in the Dust Bowl, that I think in a lot of ways that portrait really just existed as that portrait, whereas now we have someone like Ai Weiwei appropriating this image and using it for some kind of end that's a little, you know, trying, and then we have people, you know, recreating this image and it's shared and, you know, it's changed. And I think that
But it sounds like you're mixing up, or at least in the way it's spoken now, two things are being conflated.
Yeah.
And one is how a work of art gets taken by other people and influences other artists.
Yeah.
And the other is the political
right.
impact that it has in the world, which I think is what Alan was maybe talking about, which
Right.
is certainly true in Vietnam, where
Right.
the image of the general shooting the guy in the head goes all over the
Right.
world.
Eddie Adams.
The napalm, yeah, the napalm.
Eddie Adams.
Right.
But I do think there's an argument that I'm hearing, at least, that's more about a shift in the power of speed and dissemination that we're seeing now. Maybe not localized just as photography, but how photography is taking part in the internet and in its speed. Its speed is different. The ability for someone to respond with a new cropping of that photograph, or to respond
Right.
with a performance that echoes or adapts that photograph, that kind of speed we haven't seen before now. So I mean that's
Right, well,
that I would notice.
It's something about like the viral culture, and I think also like that's like what I think that the strong correlation between the political and the aesthetic that we're trying to make there is this moment where, and I think it actually, for me, is not actually super interesting in terms of specific political application now, and much more so in terms of like artistic aesthetic application, but
Right.
this moment where David is making these paintings that are attempting to do exactly what the photographs did in Vietnam and what these photographs have done now, but the technology of painting and the technology of disseminating an image and the technology of photography sort of are at odds, and not in rapid succession, but in general historical succession, kind of hit this nexus where what they're able to do and what they're sort of meant to do don't necessarily line up, or there's an exchange. And I think
This is a shift.
it leaves me in a place where, like, a big question that I have in my own work as I'm referencing all this art history that like I'm into for whatever reason, is that I have a great fear of nostalgia. Like, I don't want to make work that feels nostalgic for something.
Why?
Because I feel that nostalgia is often cowardice, and I think that specifically with my interests in kitsch, kitsch is like a distant cousin to nostalgia, but it feels more proactive to me, because kitsch is about longing and loss, right? It's like if we think about a snow globe as being the vacation that you can't have again because it's already over, but you can keep it on your mantelpiece. It's about keeping it in the mind's eye, which then begins to function like memento mori to me, or vanitas, and it feels much more like a genesis for new information and for moving past the sadness or the loss, whereas nostalgia to me feels about dwelling and staying and not moving forward. And especially because so much of what I reference in my work and what I love aesthetically exists heavily on a principle of extreme socioeconomic racial inequality, I am very self-conscious about the potential to exist in a space where I'm simply glorifying that without thinking about its full function, because I think that aesthetics are a dire part of real life, and I feel like responsible to that in the same way it affects like how we exist. So I think that that's where a fear of nostalgia comes, and I think it's a question that I have as we're thinking about this sort of pre-modern or allegorically based imagery, is how and why does that function now through photography as opposed to painting? And for me, it's exciting to think about the potential of contemporary allegory to not have a specific referent in the way that even like viral culture allows us to. I mean, like, I just started following, do you guys know that this thing that, like the world's most beautiful convict? Do you know that guy? So I just found out that he's like out, and he's like a model now, and he has an Instagram account, and I can follow him and like see what he's doing with his kids, and it's about him being a symbol, but it's also about him being him. And I think that like that tension, if we're going to think about him almost as like a contemporary allegory, is pretty exciting and pretty specific to photography, I feel. In the way that we feel we're looking at someone's face rather than a face, and how it can switch back and forth.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, one problem that I have in referencing the way that media functions in photography is that whole discussion is very different from talking about the way photography functions as fine art in this or any time.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, like, just to talk about the tools, for instance, you know, the tools in media require speed, and the tools that a lot of major fine art people, or, you know, really dedicated fine art people use still are slow. And they're very different conversations, I think. But a lot of times when we talk about, philosophically about photography, we are talking about photography as impacting the world socially and politically outside of the art context. And yeah, you know, like what, and there are a lot of things in your practice that I think maybe inspired by that media context or social media context, but that are so different maybe in their time.
In this, excuse my Reaganism, trickle down, like permeated everyday sort of experience. So like when I'm shopping at Home Goods or Michael's Crafts or going to a restaurant in Chinatown and seeing how those spaces are decorated, I'm seeing things that talk about all of these slow read kind of things, but that are being consumed just as quickly as everything else. And I believe that the people who consume aesthetics are like smart about them, even if it's not in a conscious way, so that in its basic form, when we see somebody use the symbol of a column, even like a cartoon column as an emblem for a bank, we understand that they're referencing, at the very bare minimum, classicalness. And if that doesn't even have a specific reference, we know as a culture that it means power, maybe purity, something like that. And so I think that like a slow and fast read can happen at the same time. And I don't know, I'm hesitant to say that I'm not just about the fast social media read. I think that the people who will read it slowly are a much smaller and much less interesting audience to me. I mean, I'm into the slow read, but...
I think your question's really interesting. I mean, I want to expand on it a little bit. Because I brought up this Dorothy Lang portrait, and I think that what I'm sort of talking about and why I think like photography is sort of like in this really interesting moment, exciting moment, that's different in a lot of ways from other things, is that its ability to kind of function in a lot of different ways and places at once. And I think this is something we've been talking about, something you said in the beginning when you said that it's a portrait of my friend. What did you say? It's a portrait of his drag persona. And it's an odalisque, where it has, I think photographs can function, the gap between the ways, the different ways the photographs can function has sort of shifted and become kind of smaller. So when you Google search this portrait of of Elaine Curdy on the beach, you get all of these other people that have appropriated and changed the image to be something completely different, and so it functions, in lots of different ways. And so this, in my opinion, you can sort of look at this portrait, and then you can look at this, which is Ugolino and his sons, which is, he's condemned to death, and he and his sons are put in a tower and left to starve to death. And this is supposed to be depicting the moment at which he realizes that he is going to have to eat his sons to survive. And I think that there's a direct kind of correlation with this image in a lot of ways that's really interesting. But
do they function different socially though?
Well, I mean,
because of the photograph, to Alan's question, it's like the photograph
versus the sculpture.
Do you understand what I'm trying to ask? Like, the photograph is able to do. The photograph was paid for by the government to do a specific thing.
Right. I mean, I don't know what the function of this was supposed to be, but it's
allegorical.
Right, it's
pre-modern.
Right. But again, there's a big gap between these two things, and I don't think if you Google search this image, you don't get. Anyway, I think that the gaps between these things have kind of become smaller, and they get smaller as it kind of time moves forward. Whereas this portrait is a portrait of Giraudet. It's a self-portrait who was David's student, and what happened was David saw this painting, and it's not political, which David is against at the time. It's overtly homosexual, and so I mean, there are arguments that support, this is supposed to be an appropriation of this face to basically recontextualize this face into being this political thing that is not homosexual. And so I think the gap kind of, and again, so it's like this the difference between where these things are appropriated and changed kind of gets a little bit smaller when you get to the 19th century, and then again it's like a little bit. I think Ai Weiwei is appropriating the Elaine Curdy. These performance artists in Morocco are adopting the Elaine Curdy. There are lots of people who are sharing it and changing it and manipulating it and performing it in lots of different ways. And I think, not that that hasn't been happening, but I think that what's interesting is the ability for the increase in visual literacy of people to be able to look at an image and say it looks like that, it looks like this, it looks like these things, and it can function in lots of different ways, and the ability for people to be visually literate has increased and become more important. And so the way that we deal with that in our work is to look at lots of images and look at and adopt the history of these aesthetic
Do you think that
ideas.
the ability of people to be visually literate has increased, or the ability for people to create visual content?
I think
Because I would say that like
Yeah.
visual literacy
Yeah.
in wholesale predates whatever regular literacy. What do you know? What I
Right.
mean?
No, I agree. I mean, it's like Chinese. The Chinese language basically is all visual. It's all visual literacy. It's like every little it's a pictorial language.
But I even mean in like larger sweeping cultural senses, like the way I was talking about the column, or like red
Yeah.
coral.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Red coral is like literally the hottest shit at Home Goods right now. You can
Right.
buy so much fake red coral.
Right.
And I don't think that most like high school art history classes talk about the history of red coral. We're not
Right.
talking about the Gorgon being slaughtered by the sea. We're
Right.
talking, you know, it's like that reference hasn't made it, the whole story hasn't made it all the way through, but the symbol has.
Right.
And for me, that's like very exciting, and it gives me like a lot of confidence in.
Right.
Well, and following up on this this line of thought, though, I'm also wondering if the change is really a question, if whether you guys think the change is actually in the artwork, if the shift is happening in the artwork, or if the shift is happening it's a difference of recognition. Like I wonder if it's that we just now recognize differently. I don't mean now, but in our more recent present, that we now recognize that we can't really separate the political and the social
Yeah.
from some aesthetic plane,
Right.
and that perhaps not only can we not, but it's problematic to even consider it, which is why we can now look back into pre-modern works and see hotly political problems in the work, because it's actually inseparable from the work.
Right.
Politics
Well, we were even. I mean, earlier we had this conversation about whether. I'm going to say the word we said we weren't going to say. We had a whole conversation about whether or not we were going to use the word queerness tonight, and part of the reason why we decided not to, and I'm now breaking our agreement, was that we were having trouble locating it specifically within how we think about art history, specifically because our conversation was in opposition about whether art history involved queerness or queerness could be found in art history. I know that's like a sort of flat semantic, but I think we felt like...
Right. Like, is this a queer image?
Well, you know, Plato, Socrates, why not use it? I mean, it's been used since antiquity, no?
What do you mean?
Plato talks about it, Socrates talks about it, no?
Right, but I guess that there would be a
What's the
question...
problem?
What do you mean, what's the problem?
The problem is the word is really complicated. I don't think we really had a serious problem.
No,
using
we-
it. We're just
I'm
it's just
sort of
that like
lighthearted.
it's just that we were having a conversation about it, and it kind of got like out of control. Like it was hard for us to really know what we were saying, because it's a word that was used, you know, I feel like it's a used and reappropriated and changed and describes an aesthetic that I don't know, like it's.
Well, it's sort of like, I think what it came down to is like, if we can pinpoint homoeroticism, do we call that queerness? If we can pinpoint moments where David's student is being like shamed by his teacher for making homoerotic imagery, does that then make David's painting queer? And the question is really like,
Right, and this
are
is a
we
pretty
calling
sexy
it?
portrait.
And are we calling it out of the history, or is it inherent in the history, and does that matter? And what are we then supposed to like do with that as a building block? So like to think about it for my practice, like how these objects exist, and is a classical reference inherently in some way a queer reference every time? I think I would say no, because I think that the queerness has to be fought for, and it's not given up in the annals of history. But I think that like there is another argument where you could say these things are hidden and embedded. So the question, sort of to go back to why we are both interested in hovering around allegory as opposed to specific referent, is like, are these it basically, is it coming from within or without of the history?
I took a homoerotic tour of the Met by someone who gives those tours in different cities, including Boston.
Great.
And, you know,
It's
he
like
was
an
very
Oscar Wilde or
scholarly,
something.
and had a lot to say about all the selections that he made of objects and paintings and their history and so on, pointing to, you know, who made them and what their predilections were, and, you know, how it came to be, and also how it came to be or not to be in particular museums. Like the Met has a history of precluding the homoerotic, whereas the Boston Museum is full of it.
Right, well, the
Right.
Boston has I've forgotten which Italian sculpture it is now, but they have the famous sculpture of the sleeping hermaphrodite, which is like a big deal.
Yeah, like I was speaking of. I mean, it's interesting if you look at like this picture by David. Like, there are arguments that say basically that he's picking up on Roman. This is the intervention of the Sabine women. It's the history is whatever. I mean, they didn't fight the men didn't fight in the nude, and all the men are nude, and all the women are clothed. Like, why? You know, there are people who say that it's, you know, because he's referencing Roman and Greek aesthetics, but is that really what he's doing? Because if you look at his other portrait, I mean, this is a really sexy dude, and like the reason he's in the bath is that he has leprosy. I mean, this doesn't look like a man who has leprosy. This looks just like an attractive man. So, I mean, David is sort of the center of the art world in France at the time, and as you sort of move forward through the 19th century, you get like Ang, who's painting mostly naked women in baths, and then Courbet, who's painting the Origine du Monde, which is just, you know, big vagina in your face. So I think, you know, it's...
And also Stonebreakers on the other side.
Right. I mean, all this to say is that, like, there are different points in time when, like, there are different kinds of aesthetics that are popular, and
I like
why and how, and...
I like that you're able to talk about these giant jumps between different centuries, but I was also hoping you might go into your own collaboration, The New Nothing, where you guys have these jumps between one image and the next, and they're much subtler than that, right? Sometimes it's a visual cue, sometimes it's the subject matter, but they're not titled, and I'm not saying that you should necessarily tell me they're the titles of these pieces, because maybe they aren't titled, but perhaps you could say something about each one.
Yeah, I think that's a good. That'd
That'd be a good way to...
a good prompt, because, well, I think that titles are interesting, and of course it's interesting that you're asking that question, but the format is uniform on the blog, so we've been assigned to quote these the way that they've been quoted, but I also think that the titles, at least for me, which are very specific in the context of my larger work, are completely irrelevant in reference to the way that I've structured the conversation with Matthew, or we've structured it with each other. I don't know, when I do it, I feel like I'm mostly responding in a very like guttural aesthetic way. Like I said, call and response is the easiest way for me to think about it. And also, trying as hard as I can to not, although I think I only managed to do it once, but to not do like my work, and to try and do like, sometimes I make other pictures, but I guess I'm kind of stuck on the...
I like the through line, but like, why would you start with the skull?
Oh, because you have to start with death.
But I think one of the interesting things to me about, and sort of all this stuff about visual literacy is why I bring it up and why I talk about it and why I think about it, is that, and one of the things that's been so exciting about working on this specifically is that, you know, we are able, at least, we communicate in images a lot, where we'll send each other images over our phones, and that's, we don't even have to like add a text or anything, because we can communicate that way. And so I think in the way that, you know, the communication, the ability to communicate through...
In school, I think that we're the same age. There's a lot of things that are sort of synchronistic. I'm saying something.
Sorry.
I was about to say we sometimes treat each other like siblings. But what was fun for me often is that I get to think about the ways in which I'm not Matthew, which for me, in the biggest sense, are the way he's able to construct a photograph, which in my opinion is some of the most complicated image making I've seen, you know, like maybe of any photographers I know. His pictures make no sense to me. They're super fucking weird and hard to deal with. And my pictures are all completely straight on, even lighting, easy to read, and so that's like very dramatic for me. And also, excuse me, I think Matthew's actually a pervert and I pretend to be a pervert, and so that's an exciting tension for me. And so for me to be able to look at all of his pictures, which are things that he's really experienced, and the way that he spoke about it today, like getting to like meet these people and like chase this thing, which is something completely outside of anything I could possibly even imagine doing, and then I get to throw in my picture of like a whorehouse of mannequins fucking, and that's like the closest I can get, is like exciting for me because I want to be a pervert, I just am not, and I get to kind of like sidle up next to him and see what I can get going.
I mean, I think to me,
Sorry.
along that vein, I think, you know, I always got my jollies from whatever, from going out and like meeting people and doing weird things, and it was like that was what was exciting to me. So to like after I kind of spent some time with Rachel and with her work, I really spent more time in the studio because I have no real ability to like construct images or construct anything from stuff that's like not really there. So to like looking at that isn't like already in front of me. Like it's like if I walk into somebody's home, there's like stuff for me to look at and think about, and like I'll say like you go here and we'll move the couch there and the light is really nice there, so you know put you there and that looks great. But I have no ability to like walk into a studio or walk into like a Home Goods or whatever and like buy a bunch of stuff and be like let me put it together in a way that like, and Rachel can really do that. So I think I like really made, you know, looking at a lot of this stuff. Looking at her stuff, I started making images like this, where I was constructing them, and that was really hard.
I mean, on the way here, you said you hate color, but
I know, and now I started using lots of color. But this work, I think a lot of it was really. I have it here. This work I sort of made after spending a year looking at Rachel's work. This stuff is like now it's like my apartment, where I was like really kind of thinking about how I was constructing things, and that was. This is all Rachel Stern's influence.
oh come on, but I'm not. But I mean.
In a lot of ways.
What I think is, what I think that like. I was getting at it before, but the differences are as exciting as the similarities, and the spaces where like Matthew's pictures are able to completely fall off, either into darkness or confusion, or like a confusion of perspective. Like there's a confusion of image that happens in my work too, maybe, but it's more about like collaging or like flattening and layering. It's sort of like two opposing means to the same end, or maybe two opposing means to opposing ends, but they meet in the middle at some point. And I think that like, I mean, I actually like am feeling really eager for you to make the next post in our conversation so we can keep going, because we haven't done it in a minute. But I think it has, like what Matthew was saying for him, like a literal effect where like if I post a picture and then he sees something of it in one of his own works and then post that, I'm able to reconsider what I've done in my photograph and think about like moving forward with, I mean, like I was saying before, this huge admiration I have for his ability to compose an image that is like 30 images by the use of reflection. And actually something I wanted to ask you was what you think about the difference experientially between a reflection and a photograph, aside from temporality.
What?
Like, do you think that it's really different to, like, how would you say, especially like within a single photograph, I wonder if you have one, what the difference is between a photograph and a reflection?
Oh.
Is that a dumb question?
No.
Because you were talking about it, somebody hit on, I forget who, but somebody was saying, at some point when we were talking about mirrors.
Well, I just want to say one thing first. Is that to your question of just like how we're kind of communicating, I think like it's its own kind of. I've learned a lot from doing this, about communication, just like specifically of like what's actually happening, and I think this like the communication, you know, the communication is a terrible compromise. It's like it's just sort of two people kind of in a room talking to each other, or like and like whatever they're, it doesn't matter what they're talking about, is because like what the like exciting thing about talking to somebody is like really being able to like listen and hear and respond, and like how you respond doesn't matter at all. And I think that with this, you know, it's my response is like I saw the hand and then I saw a hand, and then I don't know what you saw.
I saw the elbow and then I put an elbow.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to be a pervert.
And I saw like this shape, and I saw like this shape and that shape, and like the blackness and the blackness.
Which is like, especially coming out of grad school, not a way we're often like afforded to seriously think about our work. In a way that's
Right, I mean, I
very
saw
exciting.
this, and I saw like, you know, this is layered. You know, that's layered. And I imagine you saw the blue, you know, and then I saw the blue and the like the shape of the body.
And that scary head.
And so like the way that we're communicating through this is like
Oh, come on, that guy's head is really scary.
this
Yeah,
this guy.
yeah. Okay.
I mean, I guess the difference to me between like photography and like reflection is that like photography just fixes what reflection is temporal.
That's it?
I guess. I don't know, I never thought about it. To me it was always this sort of just like visual element. It's like paint. Mirrors are like paint, different color paint. Or it's just like another visual element that I can use to manipulate a photograph.
I guess I was thinking about like,
I could come up with something philosophical, but like, I don't.
Okay.
Matthew, I was wondering about taking what you were saying about conversation, and both of you were saying, and compromise, taking that back into the context of the project with the older men, and you said that, you know, in the end you decided, you know, Floyd was shit, you know, I think good choice. But it sounds, at least in the initial conception of the project, that there's, you know, that there's something about the, you know, the Oedipus complex that intrigues, and so I'm wondering if you could talk about whether, you know, you have, I don't know if it's too much here, but desire for these men, or if that came to develop over time, what they knew about that, how they experienced it, and what went back and forth in that conversation and compromise to make these pictures. Just really the relation, you know, the tale of the relationships and how they change.
I mean, it's hard for me to say because I don't want to speak for them because, you know, none of them are here. But, you know, this is somebody that I worked with a lot over the course of what I was doing. And I think I spent a lot of time really getting to know some of these people. Others I would only spend I wouldn't spend as much time with. You know, I don't even know, I don't think I could really answer that, except to say that like it's really complicated. In that, like, you know, you can fall in love with somebody that you have no attraction to over the course of time, and that shifts and changes and will mean different things, and that like it's just, you know, I think one sort of has relationships with people that they spend time with, and those can be loving, those can be sexual, it can be anything else. It can be a lot of things.
But the
It can be
photographs are titled
simply
with their
like-
names, right?
Yeah.
But the photographs are, I mean, they are themselves. The photographs are titled with the names of the men. We actually both title
Yeah.
our work with the names of the men.
Right. Yeah.
Do you
So-
I mean, continue to have like contact with them?
Yeah.
I've met many of them, and I haven't even known Matthew for that long. They come to his openings.
Yeah, they're homies. These guys are great. They have a great sun deck and a blind dog.
It would seem like a place like Berlin and New Orleans would be easier for you to do that kind of work in because the spaces are more generous.
Yeah.
and they're closer to nature.
Yeah.
But I think it's also like, and I don't want to speak for you, Matthew, but I think that like there is a tension of them existing in both of our work as both themselves and as stand-ins for something that is not specific beyond a symbol. So like they're able to hold a space both of Jack and as an older man reclining, or an older gay man reclining, or a reclining white figure, or what, you know, whatever you want to call it. But it's like, I think that to talk about like what photography is doing versus like why are these photographs versus paintings is like what's exciting about something like, where's that one picture that you were just showing? This guy, oh come on. The one with the guy with the big tattoo on his butt. This to me, this is like where photography works is like, and allows it to do both things at the same time, is that this guy is like, the position is emblematic, his body is emblematic, even being tattooed is emblematic, and on the other side of it being scarred is emblematic, but this scar running through his tattoo is a disruption that makes it feel like I'm probably not going to find many pictures of this specific indicator, and it allows it to feel like this person. And I think that like that zooming in and out of that relationship in your work especially is something I see all the time, especially because so many of the figures repeat and so many of the figures don't. And so there's no super strong logic to the cast of characters.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think...
Well, I was just going to say that what was so immediately striking about seeing both of your work and spiels next to each other was that, Matthew brought up Freud as like the first thing that like launched him going out into the world to meet these guys. I mean, I don't want to mischaracterize you, but like what I found interesting about that in relationship to how Rachel talked about history and this whole like span of the material world going from like Joanne's fabric to, antiquity and going back into the studio by herself, is that what's so interesting, the interesting opposite for me is that it seems like, not to be reductive, is that like Rachel is being, you're like alone in the studio thinking about the material world, and Matthew is out in the material world thinking about some inner psychological space. And I just wonder if, I don't know if you guys, it's really more of a passing thought, but I'm sort of interested in
I mean, I think that definitely characterizes our work pretty well.
Yeah, that's spot on, but it also makes me feel very sad.
Well, I didn't mean it like that.
No, I know, I just wish that
We're both alone.
I just wish that I could connect
I'm with
to people.
and you're... We both exist in our own little worlds.
No, but I do think that that's interesting, especially because like, so I am interested in referring back to like the photo studio as an entity, and so often there's this question about like the photo studio and like the history of photo studios and whatever, but as like the studio for an artist, but less than just being an isolated room, it's only your room for 40 minutes of the day. And it's like, what can you make happen, what world building or whatever can you make happen in a temporary space for a temporary amount of time that is either real or fake depending on how you feel about it. And so I think that happens in inverse in Matthew's work to some extent.
Right, I just sort of interested in the same thing, just, in terms of humans. Like what does it mean to be in a relationship with somebody? Is it always real? Is it always fake? Sometimes it's fake, sometimes it's real. Sometimes it means something, sometimes it doesn't. I guess it was like, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Just touch me.
I think they're both very related in the sense of performative figures too, but Rachel's are very theatrical and Matthew's are trying to be natural or in a natural context.
Sitting in the
But they're
kitchen
still
getting a hand job.
performing things.
Oh, come on, you do that all the time.
That's true, I do. Yeah. I mean, it's right.
Well, I think it also is a level of self-consciousness that my figures are presenting themselves from within a context of artifice and are like maybe saying like I'm a little real, and Matthews are pulling it from the other direction, because the posing, I mean, Matthews, like, I think a much much more adept at actually getting to the real classical pose, like that you could see in the statues or the paintings, whereas I sort of like to think about, I always think about the opening, not the opening scene, but that scene, the photo scene in Blow Up when I'm shooting people, and that like I want to make the person feel like they're being photographed, and so the pose ends up becoming something more like a pose of a pose, and I think in Matthew's work, it is able to sort of relax into the like resonance that we see. I don't know the name of the sculpture, but in that the guy who's going to eat his kids, where every time I see that sculpture at the Met, though it is obviously marble, the tension in the muscles is like very convincing. And I think that's something that happens in Matthew's work.
I think you're very specific about the way that you're working, and like I am just sort of a mess.
But also you're interacting with the person, I'm controlling, I mean part of what I do when I'm photographing is like, I make the person, I give direction to every single finger.
Right.
I want everything to be posed.
Right.
And I think you're creating context for an experience
I'm sort
with
of just
strong
like,
aesthetic guidelines,
I'm just sort of
but
like,
it's...
React.
Right.
React. Do something.
I'm the wrong person, I'm the wrong one.
React, Rachel.
No.
I think that's a good place to end.
Thank you, everyone. Any last comments, questions? Now that we can see them. Okay.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
As soon as I saw him,